80,000 Ottoman soldiers march into a frozen valley, certain of total conquest. The fog swallows them whole, and 20,000 hidden defenders tear them apart. This is the Battle of Vaslui, 1475, one of the greatest military ambushes in history. Smash that like button and subscribe right now, because this story is going to blow your mind. By the year 1475, the Ottoman Empire was not simply powerful. It was the most dominant military force the world had ever seen. It had been swallowing nations whole for over a century. In the year 1453, just 22 years before our story, Sultan Mehmed II cracked open the walls of Constantinople, erased the Byzantine Empire, and sent shockwaves of terror through every throne room in Christendom. After that, the Ottomans kept moving. Serbia fell, Bulgaria fell, Bosnia fell, Wallachia, the principality just south of Moldavia, had already been subdued and forced to pay tribute. And now, in the bitter winter of 1475, the empire turned its eye north, toward Moldavia. The man Mehmed II sent to finish the job was Hatem Suleiman Pasha, a battle-tested commander with decades of victory behind him. His army was enormous, somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 fighting men, with the most widely accepted estimate at approximately 80,000 soldiers. Among them were Janissaries, the elite professional infantry of the Ottoman Empire, men who had trained for war since childhood, the finest foot soldiers alive. There were thousands of heavy cavalry, skilled archers, siege engineers, and field cannon. This was not a raiding party. It was a force designed to end a nation. Against all of this, Stephen the Great could field approximately 20,000 men. 1 against 4. On paper, the result should have been swift and absolute. But Stephen was not a man who fought on paper. He was a man who fought on ground. His ground, on terms he chose, in conditions he manufactured with ruthless precision. Stephen III of Moldavia, later proclaimed a saint by the Romanian Orthodox Church, was one of the most gifted military minds of the 15th century. Since seizing the throne in 1457, he had won more than 30 battles against enemies on every side. He was not lucky. He was a man who read terrain the way other men read faces, looking for every hidden advantage, every possibility others walked past without seeing. And the frozen valleys of Moldavia in January were full of possibilities for a man with eyes sharp enough to see them. The fog that rose off frozen rivers in the early morning hours was so dense you could barely see 3 feet in front of your face. For an enormous conventional army expecting open battle, that fog was a hazard. In the hands of Stephen the Great, it was a killing weapon. Stephen knew the Ottomans were coming weeks in advance. His spies tracked their route. His scouts measured their speed. He knew the size of the column and roughly when it would arrive. And so he did something that separated him from nearly every commander of his age. He chose the battlefield long before a single Ottoman boot touched it. He walked the ground himself, studied it with the intimate knowledge of a man who had lived in this land his entire life, and selected a narrow valley near the town of Vaslui, where the Barlad River cut through the landscape and created a natural bottleneck. Inside that valley, 80,000 men could not spread out. They could not maneuver. They could not bring their full strength to bear. They would be forced to funnel in, compressed, blind, and surrounded, into a space that Stephen had already mapped in his mind to the last tree in the last frozen bend of the river. He ordered earthworks built on the high ground above the valley. He positioned his infantry deep in the tree line on both flanks, concealed so completely that they were invisible until the moment of attack. He placed his field artillery at elevated points where they could fire directly down into the valley floor. He stationed his cavalry in hidden positions on the outer flanks, waiting for the trap to close. He ordered every church bell in the region silenced. He moved his forces only at night, in small groups, using trails the locals knew by heart and no Ottoman scout would ever find. He created an army that did not seem to exist, an invisible force coiled around the valley in perfect silence. And then he waited. He waited for the thaw, and the Ottomans, marching forward through the cold with the confidence of men who had never truly feared anything in their lives, walked straight into it. The morning of the 10th of January, 1475, was one of the coldest mornings in Moldavian memory. The temperature was savage. The ground was iron hard. A dense, almost supernatural fog had settled over the valley before dawn and had not moved. It blanketed the frozen surface of the Barlad River, swallowed the tree line, and reduced visibility to almost nothing. The air smelled of ice and pine and deep, suffocating winter silence. And through that fog, 80,000 Ottoman soldiers began their advance. Suleiman Pasha ordered the push. The Janissaries led, disciplined, fearless, utterly confident, stepping forward into the white nothing with the calm certainty of men who had never once been ambushed in their careers. Behind them came the cavalry, the auxiliary infantry, the artillery trains, an ocean of men, iron, and horseflesh, all funneling into the narrow throat of the valley, all pressing forward, all completely unaware that 20,000 Moldavian soldiers were crouched in perfect silence on every side of them, watching. The Ottoman scouts had gone out. They had searched. They had found nothing alarming. What they had not found, what was impossible to find in that fog, in those frozen forests, among men ordered not to move, not to speak, not to breathe loudly, was everything. Stephen was positioned where he could watch the valley fill. He let the column advance deeper and deeper. He waited until the maximum number of Ottoman soldiers were fully committed to the valley floor, until the trap was loaded to capacity and there was no clean way out. And then he gave the signal. The horns of Moldavia tore through the fog from the hills. For one heartbeat, the valley went completely silent. Then the world exploded. Moldavian infantry poured down from the high ground on the eastern flank. Thousands of men cascading out of the tree line and hitting the Ottoman column in the flank before a single soldier could form a defensive line. The crash of steel and bodies was enormous. Then the artillery opened up from above. The field guns of Stephen the Great, positioned with terrifying precision, began hammering the compressed mass of Ottoman soldiers on the valley floor below. In that narrow space, every cannon shot echoed and re-echoed off the frozen hillsides until it sounded like the sky was cracking apart. Men fell, horses went down screaming. Smoke mixed with fog until the valley became an impenetrable wall of noise and blood and chaos. And then the western flank erupted. Moldavian cavalry came screaming out of the forest on the right side, hitting the column simultaneously with the infantry assault on the left. The Ottomans were being struck from three directions at once, in terrain where they could not spread out, could not retreat cleanly, and could not see through the fog well enough to understand the scale of what was hitting them. This was the core genius of Stephen the Great. He had not simply set an ambush. He had engineered a system of interlocking devastation, each element triggering and amplifying the chaos of the last, each wave of violence compounding the panic of the one before it. The fog was working harder than 1,000 additional soldiers. The Ottomans could not identify targets. They could not locate the main attack. Every direction produced noise, violence, and sudden death without warning. The Janissaries, disciplined and brave as they were, tried to form defensive lines. They tried to create order in the chaos. But the ground refused them. The frozen river at their backs, the marshy churned ground along the banks, the uneven frozen terrain. It was impossible to hold tight formations here. Men slipped on the ice. Horses stumbled and fell in the dark. Officers shouted commands that no one could hear over the roar. The compact mass of 80,000 soldiers that had been the greatest strength of the Ottoman army in open battle became its most catastrophic vulnerability in this choking valley. There was nowhere to go. Every soldier who tried to fall back into the Ottoman ranks was blocked by the men behind him. Every soldier who tried to fight back could not see his enemy through the fog clearly enough to aim. Every soldier who tried to retreat found himself pushing against the tide of men still streaming in from the rear, because the men at the back of the column had heard the battle but could not see it, and their orders were still to advance. They advanced. They pressed forward. They kept feeding soldiers into the killing ground, compressing the catastrophe further with every step. The Moldavian archers in the tree line poured volley after volley into the packed Ottoman formations at ranges so close that missing was almost impossible. The screaming of the wounded blended with the crash of steel and the thunder of cannon until the sound was no longer separate noises but a single overwhelming roar that made rational thought nearly impossible for every man trapped in that valley. Suleiman Pasha sent orders forward through the chaos. Form up, hold the line, push through. He was a veteran. He knew panic was as lethal as any blade. But his orders were traveling through fire and fog and terror, and many of them never arrived. Messengers were cut down before they reached their destinations. Officers relaying commands were surrounded and overwhelmed. The chain of command, the invisible thread that makes an army rather than a mob, was being severed, link by link, death by death. Then something happened that turned catastrophe into annihilation. The Moldavian infantry, having shattered the Ottoman left flank, wheeled inward and began driving the mass of Ottoman soldiers toward the frozen banks of the Barlad River. The ice. This was something Stephen had calculated with cold precision in the days before the battle. He had studied the river. He knew which sections of the ice were thick and which were not. He knew where it would hold and where it would give. His own soldiers knew exactly where to place their feet. The Ottomans knew nothing of this. As the panicked mass of men was driven toward the bank by the relentless Moldavian assault, the ice began to crack. First in one place, then another, then a dozen places at once. Men fell through into water so cold it stopped the heart within minutes, so cold that the men who did not drown immediately froze to death where they lay. The screaming that followed was unlike anything anyone on that battlefield had ever heard. Not the scream of combat. The thin, desperate, absolutely hopeless scream of men drowning in a frozen river with no way out and no one coming. For every Ottoman soldier still standing on the bank, this was the moment everything ended. When the ground dissolves beneath your feet and swallows the men beside you, something fundamental breaks inside the survivors. The will to fight does not simply fade, it vanishes in an instant. The instinct for survival takes over completely, overriding training, discipline, and every lesson a soldier has ever learned. And the instinct for survival said one thing, in every language spoken by every man in that valley: run. The retreat became a rout in minutes. The rout became a massacre that lasted for hours. Stephen unleashed his cavalry on the fleeing columns the moment the line broke. In the fog and broken terrain, the retreating men could not form up, could not mount a rearguard defense, could do nothing but run and fall and die. The Moldavian horsemen pursued them for miles. The chase lasted through the rest of that day and deep into the following morning. Every crossing, every ford, every road out of the valley that the Ottomans tried to use had been studied in advance by Stephen. Some crossings were held by Moldavian soldiers positioned there days before the battle, waiting in frozen silence for exactly this moment. The men who had marched into the valley of Vaslui with banners flying and drums beating and absolute certainty in their hearts were now running through frozen forests in the dark, hunted by an enemy who knew every trail, every hollow, every frozen stream in this landscape. Suleiman Pasha himself escaped, but only barely, and in a disgrace so complete it would define the rest of his life. What he left behind in that valley, and in the miles of frozen forest beyond it, was not an army. It was a graveyard. Contemporary estimates suggest Ottoman losses of somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 men killed, drowned, or captured, out of a force of 80,000. Entire units ceased to exist. Formations that had fought together from Constantinople to the Balkans to Moldavia simply vanished from the face of the earth in a single morning of fog and ice and fury. In the aftermath, Stephen the Great wrote letters to every king and prince in Europe. He was not boasting. He was warning. He had held the gate of Christendom, but the gate could not hold forever without support. Europe was left speechless. Pope Sixtus IV called Stephen an athlete of Christ. Across the courts of Western Europe, a man unknown outside the eastern borderlands was suddenly spoken of as one of the greatest military commanders alive. The Battle of Vaslui, 1475, was recognized immediately as one of the most decisive turning points in the long struggle between Christian Europe and the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Mehmed II returned in 1476 with a force of hundreds of thousands. Stephen could not stop a tide that size in open battle, and he was too intelligent to try. He scorched the earth, harassed the flanks, denied food and supplies, and waited for plague and exhaustion to do his work. The Ottomans finally withdrew, having devastated Moldavia but failed to conquer it. Stephen ruled for 30 more years and won battle after battle until his death in 1504. He would later be declared a saint. The Battle of Vaslui stands as one of the most decisive military engagements in European history. A legendary battle, a military history masterpiece, proving that genius of strategy can overcome impossible odds. Stephen did not win because he had more men. He won because he had something far rarer: patience to wait, intelligence to plan, and cold-nerved audacity to make the most powerful army in the world walk into a trap it never saw coming. On the 10th of January in the year 1475, 20,000 men made history, and the Ottoman Empire never forgot it. If this story gave you chills, smash that like button right now. It helps more people find incredible military history like this. Subscribe for more epic battles from the past. And leave a comment below. What was the moment that shocked you the most? The scale of the Ottoman defeat? The ice cracking beneath their feet? Or the fact that almost nobody has ever heard of Vaslui, one of the most decisive battles in European history, hiding in plain sight for over 500 years? Tell me in the comments. I will see you in the next battle.